Good evening. My name is Thorin Tritter. I'm the Museum and Programming Director at the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center located in Glen Cove, New York. I'm delighted to welcome you this evening to our book talk with Professor Mikhal Dekel about her acclaimed book, Teheran Children, a Holocaust Refugee Odyssey. Hello, Professor Dekel. This book has received a great deal of praise in various book reviews, including The Guardian, The Forward, The New York Times, just to name a small sample. The book follows Mikhal Dekel's efforts to trace her father's journey as he fled east from the Nazis in 1939, escaping from Poland into the Soviet Union, and then through Asia and eventually to Israel. But before we talk more about that book, and before I formally introduce our speaker, I wanted to put in an advertisement for a few of our upcoming virtual programs. Tomorrow at noon, I'll be holding my regular Curator's Corner program where I explore a particular object in our museum. This week, as part of our efforts to mark Black History Month, I'm going to be talking about a photograph that shows an African-American soldier who has captured several Nazis. And tomorrow night, two programs tomorrow. So tomorrow night at 7 p.m., we have a program with the 3D pop artist Charles Fazzino, who's going to be giving us a virtual tour of his studio and talking about his Heroes from the Holocaust works. And then one more thing to mention, this coming Thursday, 2 days away, at 6:30 in the evening, we're holding the first of 3 programs in our Catskills on the Big Screen and Small Screen program. The first program is going to screen an episode of The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel when her family heads to the Catskills. And after the screening, HMTC Scholar in Residence, Dr. Linda Burghardt, will talk about the historical accuracy of the depiction, discuss the popular image of the Catskills, and answer any questions you have. So I hope you'll join us for some of those programs. You can see a full list of our programs on our website at www.hmtcli.org, and then just click on the events tab. Okay, to tonight's program, and I'm going to stop sharing this. So to tonight's program, I'm delighted to introduce Professor and author Mikhal Dekel. Professor Dekel was born in Israel to a Holocaust refugee father and an Israeli-born mother. She originally trained to be an attorney in Israel, but then changed careers and began graduate studies in English, first at New York City College, and then at Columbia University, where she earned her doctorate. She now serves as a professor of English and comparative literature at City College and the CUNY Graduate Center. She's also director of the Rifkin Center for the Humanities and Arts. Teheran Children, the book we're talking about tonight, is Professor Dekel's third book, and as she has written, serves as the culmination of a decade-long journey to understand her father and the odyssey he went through, but which he never really talked about. I will leave it to Professor Dekel to tell us more about both her journey and her father's odyssey. One final comment from me before we do that about our format this evening. I have several questions to get us started, but I also urge you to write any questions you have to Professor Dekel using the Q&A feature of Zoom. Just type in your question, and I'm sure Professor Dekel will make time to speak to answer them. Okay, with that introduction and layout of our plan, let me welcome Professor Dekel to our virtual stage. I offer my heartfelt thanks, Professor Dekel, for you joining us this evening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tritter, and thank you all for joining us.
As a way to lead us off, I've said something about what your book is about, but I'm guessing you're asked this pretty frequently. Could you tell us how you describe it? For someone who hasn't read it, what is the book?
Yeah. So the book, here I'll show you. This is the book, and I should say that the book is coming out in paperback in the fall under a different name. It's going to be called In the East: How My Father and 250,000 Polish Jews Survived the Holocaust, and I'll tell you more maybe later about why the name was changed.
Okay.
But for now, I will say that my book is a part memoir, part history, and part travel narrative, which follows my journey in the footsteps of my father and roughly 250,000 other Polish Jews who survived the Holocaust by basically fleeing from Nazi-occupied Poland to Soviet-occupied Poland, and then continuing through a route of deportations and migrations through Arkhangelsk, Siberia, basically the Soviet interior, the Russian interior, into down south to Central Asia. And from there, a minority of these refugees continued on to Iran, India, Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, and other places. So in fact, this is the story of most Polish Jewish survivors. Most Polish Jewish survivors survived in the East in this way.
Yeah, I mean, it's an incredible journey. Professor Dekel and I were discussing whether we should show the map that she has in the front of her book. Zoom makes it a little awkward, but it really is an amazing journey with vast distances that your father had to cover and that you covered in your research. Really an amazing story. There's one other, before we get more into the heart of the book, we didn't pick this date for our talk completely at random. We chose February 23rd because early in your book, you talk about how in 2007, you saw an issue of a magazine or a journal called the Iranian from February 23rd, 2006, that changed the way you thought about your father's history and was part of the effort that launched you to do this project. Could you tell us a little about that article and what inspired you from it?
Right. So my father, as you said, my father to me was basically an Israeli man. He spoke only Hebrew. He was an Israeli. I knew more or less of what I knew about his past. Children, as I knew it, were children who were saved from the Holocaust by the Jewish Agency of Palestine and brought somehow from Iran to Palestine, to mandatory Palestine, and then raised in kibbutzim and so on, collective settlements. So that's more or less all I knew. I knew that he was a Tehran child. I knew that he was in Tehran during the war, but I didn't really know. And as you said, I'm an Iranian American colleague, and my colleague asks me, do you know anything about Jewish children who were in Iran during the Holocaust? And I say, well, as a matter of fact, I do. The reason he asked me is because if you recall, in 2007, the person who was the Iranian prime minister, Jad, who was a Holocaust denier, basically. And so there was all this talk about Iran and the Holocaust, and some people were saying, well, Iran was complicit in the Holocaust. They were supporters of the Nazis. And my colleague had read an article that said, actually, what the truth is that Iran saved Jewish children. There were this group of children who were in Iran, and that's the article that I read. And my colleague said, you know, he was shocked to hear that my father was one of these children. So it was really, for me, I write in the book that it was a cognitive dissonance. It was sort of to see my father, who basically I thought of as an Israeli man. I didn't even think about him as a Holocaust survivor per se. All of a sudden, he's featured in a magazine, an Iranian journal, as in a way being thought of as part of Iranian history. And that kind of cognitive dissonance really was, it was a little shocking, and it made me start to know. We know, when you ask me, the book is also about sort of figuring out what the right questions are to ask when you're writing about a story like this that's relatively unknown, really. And has not been told as part of Holocaust history. And so how do you deal with these, this information that you find out along the way? So this is, I hope this answers your question, but this is how but this is really basically the start of this book.
Yeah, yeah.
A long time ago.
Yeah. I think we've had a little, I think there's a little hiccup sometimes in the Wi-Fi or in the internet connection. So hopefully it'll straighten itself out, but I don't think there's anything you or I can do about it. So hopefully it's working for you okay, Professor Dekel.
Is it my end? Yeah, I mean, maybe I should say that I'm actually in Israel.
Oh.
I mean, the internet should be fine here, but
Right.
I don't know.
There's nothing
Sorry
we
about
can do
that.
about it anyway.
Yeah.
I was going to ask this later, but since you bring it up, I want to mention a quote from your book and ask you to talk about it. You write, most of the Polish Jews who eluded Nazi extermination, roughly 250,000 out of the roughly 350,000 who remained alive after the war, survived like my father through deportations in the Soviet Union and then as exiles and refugees in Central Asia. And yet I think the common image that most Americans have is of Jews surviving by hiding in Poland or hiding further to the West. And assuming you agree with my premise, I'm wondering, how do you explain the fact that this story, the story that you have finally told, was something that wasn't talked about and that we had the wrong image in our collective mind and collective memory?
That's a great question. And it's an important question. And I think now, especially since my book has come out, people are thinking about this. And I think it's going to become a story that now will be told and examined more. I mean, there is somebody is now working on a review of my and some other books for the New York Review of Books. And I just spoke to her, and she said, really, when I read your book, I think, why do we think about Elie Wiesel's book as like that's the story of the Holocaust, and we don't think of some other memoirs that were written by people who went through this route as the story of the Holocaust? And that's a very good question. I mean, in part, I think it's a technical question because there was no information, and there still is very little information coming out of Russia, right? So this is a story that happens outside Nazi-occupied Europe. It happens mostly in the Soviet Union and in part in the Middle East. And there is not a lot, there's very little information, for example, on the deportations. There are no images, there are practically no images from labor camps and gulags. Very few images and very generic images. So start with that when you don't have images. I mean, the Nazis documented everything they did. In my father's hometown was, and I write about this, was one of the first massacres of the Holocaust. They documented the massacre. The perpetrators themselves, the Polish bystanders. There is nothing. The Soviet Union is a kind of a black hole in many ways. It's also very hard to access archives, and I write about this in the book. When I travel, it's not that you can just go and say, hey, take me to the KGB archives and show me all the names of all the deportees. There wasn't a kind of meticulous lists and so on that, for example, people who departed to Auschwitz, we have the list and the names. People are sort of buried in these in the Soviet Union, who were deported in these vast forests, and there is just really no way to even determine who is where and what. So having said that, there is always documentations. It just requires a lot more work. And don't forget that we only started doing this work in the post-communist era. So really only since the 90s. So that's partly the what constitutes a survivor? What's the definition of a survivor? Is it only somebody who was within Nazi-occupied Europe and places where the Nazis occupied, or is it also somebody who fled the Nazis and went through this incredible hardship outside Nazi occupied Europe. So I think this story ended up not being told as part of the narrative that we tell ourselves about the Holocaust. In the Holocaust Museum in DC, this is not really a narrative that is being told, right? In the official the Holocaust Museum. Now I hope it will be eventually. They're collecting materials and so on. And when you don't have a story, you don't have a framework through which even to create an archive, to create an exhibition, to commemorate. I mean, I had never been to a commemoration of my father in any way, you know, when I was growing up. However, I will say that because I traced this whole story very, very carefully, when the Teheran children, when this group of children arrives in mandatory Palestine, to the great astonishment and welcome of the Jewish population there, when they arrive there in 1943, when they arrive, they are considered survivors and war victims and, you know, the poor orphan children and so on. It's just that in 1945, when the Yishuv, the Jewish population of Palestine, discovers what happened in death camps, all of a sudden these children who went through a horrible fate but didn't die, right? That's like, all of a sudden they are the lucky ones, and the narrative changes for that. So they're defined as the lucky ones as compared to children and other people who survived actually in you know, were deported to death camps and survived or hidden and so on. So I would say the answer is ideological as well as practical.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard this sense of hierarchy about, you know, who is a survivor and who's more of a survivor based on where they experienced the war and things like that. And I can definitely see that might have affected how people told this narrative. I've also heard that particularly in Israel, although many other places too, when Holocaust survivors made it to Israel, and this may be more for adults than children, that there was they were seen as somehow partially to blame for the Holocaust, and they were embarrassed about being in the Holocaust. And so that for the first decades after 1945, they were unlikely to tell their stories, and they were really encouraged to just move on. And now your father came survived as a child, and what is 15, 16? How old is he when he gets to Israel?
15 when he came to Israel, yeah.
So maybe a little different for him, but for people who came that route and made it to Israel, I think maybe that's another factor.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. And I mean, not only did Israel and other places as well. I mean, people came to America as well. I mean, there was not that awareness of trauma, and in fact, the categories of, for example, of PTSD developed after the war. They developed through treatment of Holocaust survivors. So there wasn't that awareness. So of course, also, you know, Israel was definitely founded on this idea of strength and the turning our back to being victims as Jews and so on. But there was also really kind of a lack of knowledge. And these children, yeah, I mean, they came, they tried to help them. They tried to help them catch up with their studies or whatnot, but nobody actually sat with them, collected their testimonies, and also just simply tried to help them. And so it took, you know, several decades for that to happen.
We've gotten a little bit ahead of your book, and I'd like to let people know something about the kind of content. And much of your book is you digging into what you found out about where your father was at different times and what he experienced. And I wondered if I could get you to back up a little and start by telling us where he was on September 1st, 1939, when the Nazis invaded Poland, and how he and his family escaped from the Nazis.
Yeah. So on September 1st, they are in their hometown of Ostromazowiecka. It's a small town in Poland where his family had lived for, as I found out, for 8 generations, which was quite shocking to me. This town is somewhere between Warsaw and Białystok. It's right in the middle, basically. In September 1939, September 1st, they know that the Wehrmacht is approaching, and they decide to escape to the Soviet border. They own a brewery. They get on two of the brewery's trucks, and they start driving east. And I should say, so the book is about my father, but it's also about the generic story of these people. And I interviewed quite a few other people who are not my father was also is deceased and died in 93. And many people presented this moment as a very pivotal moment. I mean, the families didn't know whether to stay put or to flee to the Soviet border because they didn't know who was worse. They didn't know who was the Germans or the Russians. It was not obvious that it would be better on the Russian side, but they decide, my particular family decides that they will escape, and they flee with basically hordes of other Polish Jewish and some non-Jewish refugees towards the Soviet side and cross the Soviet border very early on.
Oops. And then they're caught up by the Soviet Union in the Soviet Union's call for labor to work and produce food and lumber and other necessities, and pulled away into the gulags of Siberia. Am I right?
That's right. So they escaped they crossed the Soviet border into the Soviet Union. They were sort of on the border around Bialystok in that area, which is close to the border. After about 6 months, they are deported to, in their case, to Arkhangelsk, but people are deported all over, basically, as you said, according to the needs of the Soviet Republic, whether there is a needs to cut down lumber, mostly cutting down lumber to build railroads and factories and so on for the Soviets. So they are deported to what are called labor settlements, which means that you put in a train and you go somewhere and you don't know where you're going, and after 2 weeks or something like that, you're like dumped in the middle of nowhere, and that's where you are, and you're told you're never going to leave this place, this will be your life for the rest of your life, and so on. I mean, these were very difficult conditions. I mean, many people died on the transports already because there was just no food and no hygiene and so on. And they are deported and work under very, very difficult conditions for around 14, 15 months. When the Nazis invade the Soviet Union in June of 1941, they are released. There's this kind of special amnesty for Polish citizens, including Polish Jews, with the idea that they will now fight alongside the Russians, the Soviets, against the Nazis, and they're released. Most of them are released anyway, because as I found out when I traveled to those areas, in many places people weren't released and they just remained there. It's not like there was, I don't know, internet or something, and they knew what was going on. So a lot of it depended on where you were and who was the commander and so on. But generally speaking, for my family and most other families, they were released and they continued on a kind of second exile to the Central Asian republics, to Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan, in the case of my family, to Uzbekistan. And this is where really most Polish Jews would remain for the duration of the war. So most Polish Jews, including my grandparents, remained in Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. The children, my father, my aunt, his sister, and another cousin, continued on to Iran and were there for a while until they were evacuated to Jerusalem.
You know, as you said at the beginning, your book is history. It's part a memoir and also part kind of travel log and travel journal of your experiences digging up this history. And you describe going to this part of Siberia and trying to track down information. Can you give us a sense about what was that like?
It was just insane. It was, I mean, I always say, so as I said, I was born and raised in Israel, I always say that Israelis have this great advantage. Our advantages are ignorance. We just kind of like, yeah, why not? We'll go. Really bad dictatorship, no problem. So, you know, I researched, but I was also very ignorant, I would say, about what I would find and how I would find it, and sort of improvised. So I did have, as I read in the book, I mean, this is actually my favorite chapter in the book, because it's, even though the story of my father and the deportees is terrible, but my story, I think, is very funny, and a lot of funny things happen. And my host in Russia was a kind of mini oligarch type who was taking me around, and which was great, because he wasn't a regular tour guide, so he could open doors for me. But these are not areas, are areas that are still very Soviet. So even though Russia is no longer the Soviet Union, but they really are, people don't talk to you. The information is not accessible. The archives, you know, there are hours, but they're not really open on the hours that you're told that they're, and so I had to work at talking to people, you know, drinking with people, becoming friendly with people in order to get a clearer picture. But it was very interesting. And what maybe the most interesting thing about traveling to those places is that what you realize is a place like the place I traveled, which is Komi, almost everybody who lives there is a descendant of deportees. And if they're not descended from deportees, they're descended from the perpetrators. They're the sons and daughters of the guards, of the gulags, and so on. So this is like 95% of the people who live in those areas now. And so the story that for me was a story of my father's past was, for them, that was their story. That was their story of their present. They still live there. They didn't leave that place. And so that was very interesting to talk to these people whose parents and grandparents were deported to the same areas, but basically never continued on. So basically they grew up there, and now it's like second, third generation. And to, you know, some ways to see what I could have been in another life. You know, I could have been like the Russian Mikhal, or the Uzbek Mikhal, or the Iranian Mikhal, but somehow what was for my father a point of transit was for these people an end point, and for various reasons. So it was not easy to research in those places, but I was able to both get information and also get a feel of those places, and in some ways to actually reconstruct certain scenes of my father's journey. For example, in Uzbekistan, the separation from their parents, I really sort of found out exactly where it was and how it took place and when and so on. And that was, I think, very important to bring my book alive. So it wouldn't just be this kind of, you know, history book.
Yeah, I wonder, particularly in hindsight, and again, you traveled to not only the far reaches of you know, Siberia, but also to Iran, to Uzbekistan, all these places where your father had been taken. I wonder, could you have written the book without going to these places? I'm interested in the power of place personally. This is just an area, you know, kind of something I like and something I feel, but I always struggle with what is it. And so I wondered, did you need to go to all these places?
I think I did. In fact, I actually didn't go to Iran because I'm an Israeli citizen. So I could have gone, in the sense, I also have an American citizenship. So I have a dual citizenship, but it felt too dangerous for me to go there. Maybe one day I will. But I didn't go to Iran. And in some ways I feel like that's a chapter that is missing that component, even though I reconstructed from memoirs, and I had my colleague Salar Abdul research there for me. I think to me it was crucial, and I don't think I could have written this book without traveling. I would have written a different book, but I couldn't have written it without traveling. And also because a part of the book, a big part of the book, I would say, is the memory politics. I mean, you're in a Holocaust museum and you're very aware of how the story is told and from what angle. And when you travel to those places and you talk about your story to other people in Poland, in Russia, in Uzbekistan, and your story is in some ways, parts of it is their story, but they tell it completely differently because collective memory is usually it's nationalized. It's a national memory, and they tell it in completely, so they remember the story as something else completely. And so to tell the story, I wanted to be able to address that question of not only of history but also of memory, how the story is remembered in different places and how it's negotiated.
I think that it's another question I wanted to get to, so I'll jump to that one, which is, you explore, among other topics, the complex history of Poland and how Poland is both a land of perpetrators, of bystanders, and of rescuers. And you talk in particular about a relationship that you develop with a woman, a historian named Magda Gawin, I think is the way to pronounce it, who's appointed as a member of the Polish government's Council for the Protection of Memory of Combat and Martyrdom, among other things. And you talk about your relationship with her and her view of the Holocaust. Could you give us a sense of that and about her perspective about the Holocaust?
Yeah, it's funny. I'm actually writing an article about that relationship now because, of course, it's very relevant given the historian's trial right now and so on. And I mean, that's a very interesting story or side story that I really need to develop more. In part, Teheran Children was such a big book that I couldn't put all the Poland stuff in it. But yes, I mean, I was at some point approached by Magda Gawin, who was historian and now is actually Deputy Minister of Culture of the current Polish government. And her family, her Catholic family, hails from my father's Jewish family's town, Ostrowozowiecka. So that was the town where both her family and my family lived for many generations. And she reached out to me, and I was very skeptical in the beginning, but my curiosity got the better of me. So I ended up going to Poland and meeting with her, and we spent about a week together, in which she basically more or less educated me about the Polish side of sort of what happened during the war to Poles in my father's town, and so on. And I was, to me, that was a big surprise because just like Tehran was not really a place in my head in regards to my father, Poland wasn't either. My father to me was an Israeli, and he didn't speak Polish. He had nothing to do with Poland. And I didn't really think about Poland beyond this kind of terrible place from which he escaped. But, the place continued to exist after his family fled and all kinds of things happened. So at first I was very interested and moved and sort of, even though we had some disagreements about how we thought about things, but I was very curious to hear about the Polish side. And when you grew up as a Jew with this legacy, it's a very heavy burden, the Holocaust, and you sort of think, well, okay, it's somewhat liberating sometimes to think that other people suffered too, right? It's not just, the Jews were in the jungle and nobody else was affected. But eventually, and now, Magda is now the Deputy Minister of Culture and really is a kind of has become a powerhouse behind basically Polish revisionism. There's no other way to put it, especially as pertaining to this narrative of the good Poles. And I mean, as you said, Poland is a complex place with perpetrators and bystanders and rescuers. And I think what the Polish government is trying to do now is basically promote a story in which there are only rescuers And that's really not a story that aligns with historical facts. And so, and she's very much behind this. So, there's been, I mean, we're still Facebook friends, but it's definitely more complex now. I did send her the book, however.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing about, I think that you bring out about the Polish perspective is the emphasis of their victimhood, as you were saying. And so it's that they were all rescuers to the Jews and they all suffered. I mean, not all, but the emphasis on suffering as well. And that's certainly the story that was the Soviet line before the fall of communism. And now you're seeing this resurgence of it.
Yeah, and we see it, we actually see this resurgence of the story. It's not only in Poland, we see it in all the post-communist, in Lithuania, in Hungary, the story of innocence, right? Of the innocence of the local population. There was just the bad Germans and the bad Soviets came and did these terrible things to the Jews as well as to the locals, which is not really the whole story by any means. But I do think, I have many meetings in these places that I describe, and in each place I have a sort of host. And with each host, I think at some point we get to this very tense moment where the narratives collide in some way. But the book does try to the extent possible to extend dialogue, to extend empathy to as much as one can extend it. And sometimes one cannot extend it, right? But
well, I think, you really do convey an openness in the places that you visit and the people you deal with to try and understand multiple perspectives and the perspectives of people that were there at the time. I think it's really an impressive part of your book. I see a question has already been posed in our Q&A feature, and again, I'll just encourage people, if they've got questions, please type them in. But somebody asked, she says that her parents were also sent to Arkhangelsk and were allowed to leave in 1943 and went to Samarkand, where your father also eventually went to. And she says that's where she was actually born, and she never quite understood why they went to Uzbekistan. And she never was able to ask her parents. And do you have information, or could you share a little about why might they have traveled down to Samarkand?
My answer is that you should read my book, because all the answers are there. I mean, seriously, my book came out in October of 2019, and a lot of people write me exactly with these kind of questions, and they say, or they read the book and they say, oh my God, it's the first time I understood why my grandmother spoke about standing in a bread line in Tashkent, and we never knew how she got there. In fact, we thought she was making it up. So, I mean, I think, it's amazing how, when you don't have a story, you think it's kind of only your own story. And I just told you there are 250,000 people in Central Asia, more or less. So I think for a lot of people, the book sort of solves the pieces of the puzzle. I mean, they basically continued on to Samarkand for 2 reasons. First of all, Samarkand was in some ways, it was another deportation. It was another exile. I mean, they were released from Arkhangelsk, but it took me a long time to understand that too, because it's not, when I interviewed people, oftentimes they would say to me, we were released and we wanted to go somewhere warm because I had asthma and my dad wanted to take me to a dry place or something like that. But no, this was the Soviet Union. You couldn't just go wherever you wanted. So they gave you a card and they told you, you have to go to this and this kolkhoz, a kind of village near Samarkand. But regardless of that, also Samarkand was a big place where Jewish refugees, Polish refugees congregated. I mean, it was kind of word of mouth. And unfortunately, that was actually the worst place to be in 1942. I mean, there's just a tremendous famine, really, starvation and diseases and so on. So I'm very happy that this woman's, and the person who is asking the question, I'm happy your family survived. But really, in my book, you're going to find the much more intricate answers.
You know, one of the things that you talk about the treatment of what your father experienced and his family when they went down to Uzbekistan, and then further, I think also into Tehran, is that it wasn't just Jewish Polish refugees who were there. There were also non-Jewish Polish refugees, and there developed a significant difference in the way that Jews and non-Jews were treated in these kind of distant parts, unrelated to anything to do with the Holocaust, really. Could you just tell us a little about those differences and what was causing it?
Yeah, I mean, it's very complicated. It has to do with aid. I mean, there are a couple of things, but one thing is, for the Soviets, Polish Jews were not Polish. Polish Jews were Jewish. So for the Soviets, Jews were a nationality. And so that's one thing. I mean, from the Soviet side. From the Polish side, aid that was sent into the Soviet Union, and especially into Central Asia, was distributed through the Polish government in exile in London. This is also aid that was sent, in part was funded by the Joint Distribution Committee and by Jewish organizations, but it was funneled through the Polish government and then its kind of delegates. And, you know, unfortunately, there was not an equal distribution of resources in some of these places. So that's
less going to the Jewish population. And
yeah,
I mean, you talk about an orphanage where your father is, where, you know, you talk about how the non-Jewish Polish children are getting all these sweaters and clothing and in a nice building, and the Jewish orphans are put in these kind of tents or into crowded spaces and just don't get the same kind of.
Yeah. I mean, in Iran, you already have where basically members of the Zionist Agency of Palestine, the Jewish Agency of Palestine, are already there, and basically you have sort of Jewish nationality that is being formed on Iranian soil. So these children are already collected and sort of into this camp that is run by sort of Zionist youth movement counselors. And the Poles have a kind of their own equivalent and much more intricate camp in a way. So you have these two camps that are, the identification becomes very nationalized and very competitive, right? And so at that point you have, yes, quite a lot of discrimination against Jewish refugees and rivalry. It's not in every case, not in every place, but in Iran especially, and somewhat in Central Asia.
And you also talk about corruption, right? And the kind of hoarding of resources and then giving them out at some point to the non-Jewish people, and just for personal benefit. Yeah,
there's tremendous corruption. I think this is a story in any refugee crisis and any refugee aid project, you know, today as well as during the war. There is tremendous, you know, everybody cuts the piece, right? So at the end, what is left, what gets down to the children and the refugees is very little. And so corruption and also just mismanagement of resources. I mean, I interviewed elderly Iranian people, and they said, for example, we remember that after these children left, after the refugees left, all of a sudden these like hundreds of sweaters would turn up at the bazaar in Tehran for sale and so on. So, you know, and it was so tragic because they had nothing, but then all of a sudden this, so I think that's a very much a part of any refugee story to an extent, but I do, you know, write about that as well, because I worked in the archives of these aid organizations, like the Joint.
I see another question has come in from the audience here that's not something I think you address in your book, but I'm going to pose it to you and you can tell the answer. or not. And the person asks, why does Poland, if you know, refuse to pay some form of reparation from their role in the Holocaust?
Yeah, I mean, that's, I wish I knew. I mean, I do know, I guess, but I mean, their official role, I mean, the official line that they toe now is go sue Germany, right? We didn't start the Holocaust. It was perpetrated on us. And you go to The Hague and sue at The Hague for your, and I think it's not so much a question of reparations, a question of restitution, especially restitution of property. Most Polish, European Jews lived in Poland, and they had properties, and also in the case of my father, and those properties have not been, for the most part, unlike Germany and Austria, they have not been returned, or the value of them has not been returned. And that's a very sore point. I should say also that these people who were survived in the East also did not receive reparations from Germany. They were not included in the original reparations agreement that Israel signed with Germany in the 50s. So they actually received no reparations from anyone. I mean, I think in the 2000s, they received kind of a small amount, but this is something that, I mean, the Germans say, look, you were under Russian soil, so it's not our, you know, it's not that, you know, as if people just went there on vacation, right? I mean, it's a little bit absurd, the German argument too. The Poles say the Germans are responsible. So in fact, many of these people did, and this means that most Polish Jewish survivors actually did not receive any form of reparation.
And the Soviet Union doesn't offer reparations of any kind either, does it?
No, I mean, they offer to people who are Russian citizens and were deported, who remained in Russia, they offer some, you know, small benefits, like you get maybe like a vacation in the Black Sea or something for like a week in a sanatorium, or maybe some discount on one thing or another, but not really reparations. And that's actually my next book. My next book is going to be on the question of reparations and restitution.
Yeah, I think I think you're perfectly right to talk about these two different things. Restitution is different from reparations, and I can see I think another part of the Polish argument for reparations, at least for not paying reparations, is they say, well, the Polish government in exile was not involved in, you know, fought against the Nazis in every way it could. And so the government of Poland, which was in London for most of the time, was certainly not a perpetrator. Polish individuals were certainly perpetrators and bystanders, but the Polish government seems to be able to claim that it was not. And I always think it's kind of an interesting comparison with France, because in France you have the Vichy government actively collaborating with the Nazis, and individual French people working in the resistance and fighting in a much more open way. It's kind of like the opposite in Poland, but the Polish government was not in any way collaborating, and so I think they can claim, well, why would we pay reparations?
Right. Yeah. I mean, reparations is not, that's not even, that has not even ever been discussed. In fact, they would probably say we need to be paid reparations, right, by the Germans. And I think they do.
Yes.
But restitution is a different story, and they really have not, I mean, here and there people have succeeded, but we're talking about, you know, tremendous amount of property, Jewish property in Poland, that has never been returned. That was just either nationalized or taken by private people.
And you talk about some effort that you and your family undertook about the brewery.
Yeah.
To see if you could get restitution for the brewery.
Yeah, I mean, I was just looking into it when I was there, and I'm still looking into it. It's just that every lawyer that I talk to assures me that it's a completely hopeless case. So, but if I get a big, you know, if my next book gets funded well, then I can use that money to actually sue and then describe all my my unsuccessful lawsuit, I suppose.
I see another question coming in about wondering how did Iranian Jews react to the arrival of these refugees, and to hearing stories about what was going on. I don't know to how much information the refugees who made it to Iran were able to talk about what was going on in Nazi occupied Poland, since they'd been out of Poland for a long time then. But what kind of response, do you know what kind of response there was by Iranian Jews?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. It's a very interesting, I think, part of the book to me. This meeting point between these basically Polish Jews and Iranian Jews, and as well as Iraqi Jews who were also, there were Iraqi Jews who were also refugees in Tehran at the time. Now, the Iranian Jews knew nothing. They were completely cut. They didn't know anything about the Holocaust. And these people came, and they did know, because a lot of them, first of all, during their escape to the Soviet side, I mean, they experienced, many of them saw horrible. I mean, they were bombed by Nazi planes. They saw murders. Then they heard a lot of things, so they knew quite a bit. And they did share, and I think there was a lot of shock. And there was some attempt on behalf of the local Iranian population to help these children. And they're collecting clothing, and they were bringing them food. They were entertaining some of them for Shabbat dinners. They took them to a synagogue on Yom Kippur and high holidays. Some of the Polish Jewish refugees, not necessarily the children, but like who were a little bit older, few married and remained in Iran, basically. Some of them whom I met after my book came out, who contacted me. So they told them, yes, they did tell them about the war. And I think it was a very interesting meeting point of these two populations that, had nothing to do with each other and suddenly are thrown together in Tehran.
Let me ask you another question about Iran that goes back to something that you've talked about, or somebody you've talked about a couple of times, and I know we're running towards the end of our program, but you've mentioned a couple of times your colleague Salar Abdo at City College, who was part of your kind of impetus to get going and worked with you. What was his interest in the Holocaust? And I get the sense in your book, you seem to talk about how your relationship frayed over time. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a little about that relationship. Obviously, a Jewish woman originally from Israel and an Iranian meeting in a faculty lounge and being colleagues. Just tell us a little about that.
Yeah. I mean, Salah was very important for the book. And I probably wouldn't have even written the book if he hadn't really piqued my interest and encouraged me. I mean, it's hard for me to say exactly what was his interest in the book, but I think in some ways the Holocaust is, as you know, because obviously you're in the Holocaust Museum, it is there is so much pain and there is so much guilt and so much blame and all these very harsh emotions having to do, the Jews and Europeans and their culpability or blame, and somehow to be a Muslim man from Iran was in a way to be outside this story. It's outside this equation of guilt and blame. It was there was something very pure about Salar's interest in this, and possibly also simply because the Holocaust is not something that was studied very much in Iran, and so there was a true curiosity. And Salar himself was a refugee because he was a refugee of the 1979 Islamic Revolution in Iran. So in some ways, I think he could connect to the story in a very different story, but at the same time, he could connect to the story in some way that maybe a lot of other people can't. And he was, and he helped me quite a bit, especially in research in Iran, as I said, where I couldn't go, but also in Uzbekistan. And we're still friends, and so we didn't have, it's not as complicated as my relationship with Magda Gavin in Poland, but at some point he became much more, especially as Israel and Iran became much more arch enemies than they were even in 2007. And I mean, he became much, he traveled to Iran more, he became more identified with Iran, and maybe a little bit less critical of the regime than, you know, he had been initially, and so on. It became, our relationship became a little bit more, it became a little bit more tense in terms of our feelings about the Middle East and so on. But that did not really, I mean, we had a momentary falling out, but it did not, ultimately in the larger picture, it didn't really affect his interest and his support for the book. And I've given, I give a lot of, as you know, a lot of talks. And I've given quite a few talks to Iranian studies programs. There's actually an Iranian media company based in London that made a short film about the book, and hoping to sort of do Holocaust education in Iran through the book. So I guess they have their ways of sort of sneaking it in there and showing it to Iranians. So, you know, that's been very interesting, and I'm hoping the book will be translated to Farsi.
You know, one of the reason I ask is because one of the themes that kind of comes out to me, and this is something I've experienced in other parts of my Holocaust education career, which is that a lot of people see connections to the Holocaust for themselves because they, in whatever way, they see themselves as victims. And whether that's Magda Gavin talking about Poland as victim, or you mentioned this, I think, a Korean man who I can't remember if it's in Tehran or in Uzbekistan, who also is interested in the Holocaust because he sees a similar story of victimhood for himself. And yet, the more you come, I mean, you can see those connections. Yes, Jews were victims, and I was a victim of whatever I was a victim of. But when you get down into the details of the Holocaust, you confront the fact that the Holocaust was a singular event, and that what happened during the Holocaust was not the same as what happened to non-Jewish Poles or to Iranian citizens or whatever it might be, and that becomes a perhaps a bit of tension wherever that discussion starts at something that's everybody's a victim, and then comes down to what's unique about the Holocaust. And that seemed to me to come across in your book. Perhaps I read into it.
No, I think you're absolutely right, and I think I do try to. I mean, I don't think Jews have exclusivity on suffering, and I definitely hope that we don't. But I think you're absolutely right, because the more I know, and the more I research, the more I know. It is very hard to make these parallels, because the Jewish story, even in the story that I tell, which is outside Nazi Nazified Europe, where Jews are not singled out per se as Jews. I mean, they're part of like this huge wave of refugees and so on. Still, there's a very particular Jewish element to this, and to whether it's discrimination and also whether it's simply that these people lost all their families as well, you know, and so they're there, but they're somehow were saved by their deportations miraculously, but you know, their entire families have died, and they still don't know that. So yeah, I mean, I think I really try as much as I could not to get into these modes of competition of suffering, because that is just not a good thing to be doing. But you know, at the same time, I was and I am very wedded to historical accuracy and to the truth of the book, and you know, you can't deny certain facts.
And your book is powerful in that way. We're out of time, and but I wanted to say one thing more to you, which is that I happen to be working with one of my colleagues in teaching a course for 2 and 3 Gs, the children or grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, to help them find ways to tell their stories, to tell their narratives of their parents or grandparents, and to encourage them to dig in and do the research. And your book seems to me like this kind of ultra model of what those could turn into, and you really demonstrate that. But also a number of the people who are currently working with us, their families go through the Soviet Union and through Central Asia, just like your family and just like the story that you're telling. And so to kind of see this as a larger story and to realize after reading your book about how centrally important this other side of the Holocaust, this Eastern side of the Holocaust and the journeys from that, I really think is opening up a super important door to understanding the events of the 1930s and 40s. So thank you. Thank you for the book. Thank you for sharing your time with us. And really, I wish you very well, and I'm grateful for your time.
Thank you so much. And for the people in the audience, if you want to contact me, you can find my information on my website, michaldekel.com, or Twitter, Facebook, you name it. You can find it in me in many ways. And I'm happy to answer your questions and also to hear your response for the book.
Tell us, by the way, the name of the new title of the book. What's it going to be?
It's going to be called In the East: How My Father and 2.25 million Polish Jews Survived the Holocaust. And the reason Norton changed the name is exactly because the book is beyond, it tells the story beyond Iran, because it tells also the story of Central Asia and the East. Yeah, exactly. Then they want to convey that in the title as well. So,
Yep.
You know, feel free to contact me and to tell others about the book. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Have a lovely evening or morning or whatever it is there.
Night, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
Bye-bye, everybody.
great to see you.
Thank you.